To get some more perspective on how this process might work and some of the concerns raised by the opposition, I'm joined now by the leader of Alberta's NDP, Rachel Notley. She's with us from Edmonton. Hi, Ms. Notley. Good to see you.
Good to see you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I hope you're doing well as well. You support reopening. I've listened to your comments over the past week, but you've also said that the province took a backward approach by picking, quote, arbitrary dates. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, basically, what we saw was Jason Kenney sort of pick an arbitrary date, and then without necessarily setting out the benchmarks that they were going to be relying on. And then after they picked that date, they began scrambling to provide to businesses the kind of supportive guidelines that they needed in order to know how to open safely. And so, for instance, you'd be aware in Ontario, they had something like 65 sector-specific and business-specific guidelines that were released some time ago. In Alberta, we got about 13 or 14 that finally trickled out late Monday, and many of them are still very, very vague. And so we've heard from people who were to be part of phase one, being very concerned that they really aren't getting the kind of guidance and direction and support that they need from the government in time to be able to be ready for this May 14th date. And so this is a question of leadership on the part of the government in terms of getting all the homework done first in order to provide the greatest level of certainty and safety for Albertans as we do move forward to what everybody wants to see, which is a smart relaunch.
So I heard from some of those business owners early in the week right after that website was launched as well, and they were a bit confused. But over the past few days, they seem to have arrived at more clarity. And on the point you're making about an arbitrary date, it seemed to me, at least based on the press conference yesterday and what we heard from Dr. Hinshaw, that date was really chosen in concert very closely with Dr. Hinshaw. So how is it that the Premier just arbitrarily chose it? It seems like he was basing it on medical advice.
Well, I think, what we know is that the Premier chose to go out and talk about the date as opposed to talking about various benchmarks that our public health officials would like to see. At the end of the day, the decision to delay Calgary, for instance, it was taken on Tuesday, and then the Premier waited 18 hours to let people know, right before they were expecting to open. And the fact is the Chief Medical Officer of Health doesn't schedule cabinet meetings. That is what the Premier does. And quite frankly, the tracking of cases in Calgary it hasn't changed, and there was no reason to expect that it would have changed significantly. So there's no reason why Calgary businesses couldn't have been given more of a heads up, a few days earlier that this delay was going to come. But ultimately, all we're suggesting is that businesses need more support, and there needs to be more clarity provided by the provincial government and the Premier as we move forward, so that people are not as stressed and as anxious, and now in Calgary, in the situation of many of them putting money out only to see that's an investment that they may not see a return on.
I take your point on the notice, the sort of lack, I guess, thereof, a notice, as many in Calgary have chargers, particularly people who run businesses. But at the same time, during the day, I sit here and I watch, Premier Legault, Premier Ford. I watch all of the press conferences from right across the country. And what, at the end of the day, I sit there and say is, like, everybody is, it seems arbitrary a lot of the time. And I don't think intentionally necessarily. I mean, they're operating in, with a playbook that they've never had before. Are you sympathetic to that? I mean, you saw in Montreal today, for example, the Premier had said, this is the day we're opening schools. And now, not only is it postponed a week, it's now postponed until the fall, right? Like, sometimes things change and you're not able to give the notice that you want, but that's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's true. And I think there's obviously a strong tension within one government, not between governments or between different political parties within one province. There is, within any group, there is a tension between wanting to reopen and support the economy and the jobs, while on the other hand, ensuring that we do so safely. But that's why, for instance, what we found to be most convincing is this idea of setting out the benchmarks, giving people a general sense of when they think they will be able to get towards those benchmarks, and then doing all the homework in advance with respect to the kinds of guidelines that the folks who are part of the reopening, in this case, a number of different businesses, need in order to do it safely, as well as, in some cases, supports. We've been calling over the last 2 weeks for a variety of different supports to actually be provided to small and medium-sized businesses, because we haven't really seen a lot of that in this province. But in addition, folks have really been looking for clarity and advice. And we shouldn't have restaurateurs out there doing research about what it looks like in European restaurants keeping people safe in order to come up with what will work for them. And we especially need greater oversight and direction as far as it relates to keeping workers safe. And as you know, with the Cargill debacle, we know that's a thing that this province, this government has not handled well. And so we need to make sure we get the kind of rules that are necessary in place so that people who want to keep people safe know how to do it.
I want to ask you about Cargill, because we've spoken to the person who leads the union that represents the workers there, and he has called on the federal government to actually intervene and conduct an investigation into what happened. Do you support that call?
Well, we certainly, I haven't heard the most recent thing about the federal government, although we certainly do now know that as far as the food inspectors go, that's a whole other group of folks who are federally regulated. And so it would make sense that the federal government did also engage because, they weren't kept safe either. From our perspective, we've actually asked for a public inquiry primarily because Cargill obviously was not keeping the place safe. I mean, there's no question about that. Workers were raising concerns and they were being ignored. But they also raised concerns to occupational health and safety people. They also raised concerns with the minister, and they were also ignored. And so you cannot have the government reviewing the actions of the government when it comes to assessing why people died, why thousands of people became infected, why this outbreak became the largest on the continent. That we need to have people that were not part of that decision-making process assessing what happened, which is why we've asked for there to be a public inquiry. And in the meantime, we need for this government to acknowledge that there was a fundamental cultural failure there to protect vulnerable workers, and to understand that there is a role for government to do that, and that the lives of workers are never to be put at risk for the sake of production or profit making. The lives of workers are the lives of workers.
I have listened to, because it falls on our watch every night on this program, the press conference from Dr. Deena Hinshaw, and sometimes Premier Kenney accompanies her pretty much every night. And there have been a lot of questions directed to her about what happened at Cargill. And her response has been that their mistake was to focus so early on specifically and mostly on the site itself versus some of the other transmission that was taken elsewhere. Is she wrong? Are you saying that she's wrong?
I'm not saying she's wrong or right. From the perspective of a public health person, she's focusing on the overall issue and the spread within the community and all that kind of stuff. What I am saying is that to keep workers in any place safe, and in particular in a place like a meatpacking plant where you have a very vulnerable group of workers who are not typically heard or listened to by their employer. There is a completely different dynamic there. So separate and apart from the work that our Chief Medical Officer of Health was doing, there was the important work that had to be done by occupational health and safety officers, people who understand the dynamics of a workplace setting and the way in which you need to be assessing what is or is not safe. Because those workers don't have the ability to say, oh, the Chief Medical Officer of Health recommended this, so therefore I will do it. They don't have the right to do that in the workplace. It must be managed through the employer, and that needs to be assessed by people with a specialty in that area, which is occupational health and safety people. And back in the first week of March, our labor critic, both in meetings and then subsequently in legislature, specifically called on the Minister of Labor to hire more health and safety inspectors with that kind of expertise in order to go into places and make sure that they were able to keep their workers safe. So it's not about who was wrong or right with respect to the Chief Medical Officer of Health. It's about the government, the cabinet and the Premier's responsibility to understand that there was an additional mandate under the Labour Minister that they absolutely ignored and failed to assert, and they failed to keep people safe.
I guess my point in asking that was just because, we have heard from the politicians who are overseeing that they based their actions on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer of Health and of public health officials. Anyway, that's my motivation, but unfortunately I have to cut it off there because Dr. Bonnie Henry just stepped up to the podium in BC, and we've got to take that live. Thanks, Ms. Notley. Great to have you back on the program.
Thank you.